Welcome to the Doomer Optimism podcast. The special guest today is my good friend Vince Horn. Vince, probably for many people, needs no introduction, but for some people, perhaps. I first learned about Vince when I was really interested in pragmatic Dharma and meditation, and he was a major player in the space and connected to a lot of the different teachers that I was interested in at the time. And we eventually came across each other. We eventually ended up living not too far away from each other. And now we've visited each other multiple times. He's developing his own homestead, what he calls the Hornstead. I'm sure we'll get into that. And many other issues as well that I think will inevitably arise. So welcome, Vince. Nice to have you here.
Yeah, great to talk to you.
Yeah. So for the people who are uninitiated, do you want to craft your narrative in any way, in any way you like?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the highlight part that's probably important is that my background is pretty well rooted in the Buddhist contemplative wisdom traditions in particular, although I'm very happy to branch outside of those when and where necessary. And then also, I came up as kind of a tech geek, a sci-fi nerd, and someone who really loved taking apart computers, putting them back together. I started in a computer engineering program in my undergrad, and then I dropped out to meditate full time, which I do not regret. But that has been a continued influence, is sort of my interest in technical infrastructure and just kind of, I guess you'd say, like the systems level type things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. So you, a while back, you had proposed a term before Doomer Optimism was even a thing. And I believe you got it from someone else, but
Yes.
Optimism. And
Yes.
that sounds a lot like Doomer Optimism, but you got there first. Where did you come up with that term? Where did you come across that term, and how did you relate to it at the time?
Yeah, so this was a very much a term that came from a friend of ours, a student and friend named Lisa Sherman.
Mhm.
And I don't know where she came across it. She just tends to hang out with a lot of interesting folks. So I imagine
Yeah.
someone, that she knew came up with it or heard it from another friend. But several years ago, we were at a gathering of Dharma practitioners and meditators who were just getting together to compare notes and hang out.
Mhm.
And she shared it with me then during that gathering. This was probably several years ago. And it just struck me as being a really good word to point out the unique kind of insane situation that we were starting to recognize we were in at the time of like, oh, the world is falling apart. The world that we knew and grew up in
Mhm.
is no longer working, and it's becoming so incredibly dysfunctional that we can't even ignore the fact that it's falling apart anymore.
Yeah.
And yet, here we are wanting to also live in a better world that we know is possible, even if it's from our own kind of small personal experience and little tiny communities, that
Yeah.
we see that
Mhm.
there's better ways of living that could be feasible on larger scales. And it just felt like a good word to describe what seemed like the situation that we find ourselves in, where everything's falling apart, but there's some of us that want to also build
Mhm.
something new out of the refuse of that
Yeah.
collapse. And it felt like a very useful term to orient in that direction.
Mhm.
But you stumbled over it even saying it. So it's actually, it's as a term, it's limited because it's so hard to say.
Right. Right.
And so I think Doomer optimism in a way is a much better term because it's easier to say,
Yeah.
and it points to something very similar. The
Right.
basic
Right.
ideas I think pretty much the same.
Yeah. No, what
Um,
you described would be a perfect explanation of Doomer Optimism, I would say. So
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So that you heard it here first, folks. They got there first. We're
Whoever
just
they is, I have no idea.
Lisa Sherman, you,
Who
whoever else.
knows? Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, but of course, but the timing is right now for more people, I
yeah,
think, to get that.
yeah.
Several years ago, still very fringy
Right,
thinking.
right,
Still fringy,
right,
just a
right.
little less fringy.
So I'm really interested in exploring, because I feel like I went through a similar process here. So you said you were really interested in technology.
Yeah.
You went through a real strong kind of techno optimist, or dare I say even techno utopian
Yeah.
phase.
That's fair.
And then you discovered, or you started taking more seriously kind of the ecological crisis,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
you started seeing things from a more pessimistic lens, we could say.
Hmm.
I'm curious, both, kind of about what that journey was like for you, but also how it related to your meditation practice. Because for me, I think
Yes.
part of my initial interest in kind of the pragmatic Dharma meditation was just because I was so disembodied. I was still in academia, like, in my PhD program. I still kind of am teaching, but I was in a PhD program. I felt kind of disembodied, and just my everything was compartmentalized. And meditation was really helpful for me to kind of learn how to re-inhabit my body, and also to develop the awareness to be able to do that, and to
Yes.
be able to not just believe all of my thoughts,
Mm.
to notice where kind of mental fixations and neuroticism, was connected to tensions in my body, and being disconnected from my environment. Um,
Mm. Mm.
and that, uh, for me has been an ongoing process, still is, leading now to even trying to develop a homestead, and trying to learn kind of how to work with my hands, because I was in the kind of computer, analysis, intellectual world. Um,
Hmm.
and it seems to me like your journey has been kind of similar, but I'm curious if you want
Hmm.
to kind of elaborate on how your contemplative practice has changed as your worldview has evolved.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really interesting question. Because I think they do go hand in hand in my case. I think in most cases.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. There's a person in particular that I name because he showed up both in my contemplative practice, and he was a very important figure for me in terms of trying on and becoming kind of getting in relationship to this sort of I would call it an eco dystopian view,
Mhm.
but also some optimism there as well, not totally
Mhm.
dystopian, which is David Loy. David is a Zen teacher and philosopher, who lives in the Colorado area. And when I met him, I was a neighbor of his, just living up the road,
Yeah.
and we shared this beautiful trail network between our
Mhm.
homes, that went around this wonderful lake, pushed right up against the Front Range mountains as they jutted up from the plains of
Yeah.
Boulder. So
Mhm.
it was like, imagine like a god realm, and that's where we lived.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
um, and I ended up meeting David on the trail, and getting connected with him and talking to him a lot. And he came up very much in the kind of countercultural movement of the '60s,
Mhm.
um, and maintained a very skeptical view of the system. And
Mhm.
so he was also kind of an important figure in what I think he helped term eco Dharma, this movement of ecologically aware Dharma teachings,
Mhm.
uh, mostly that also are connected to a kind of engaged Buddhist perspective, of wanting to bring Buddhist practice into social engagement. Thich Nhat Hanh died recently, and he was, I think, one of the most famous engaged Buddhists, you could say.
Mhm.
So David Loy is kind of in this lineage of kind of Zen, which can be very disembodied as well at times, or like
Yeah.
not concerned with the world.
Mhm.
Um, but also has this very beautiful non-dualistic teaching
Mhm.
of emptiness, the thing that we're aiming for, the transcendent freedom, is not apart from the world and
Yeah.
from our personalities and stuff.
Mhm.
So from David, I started to have these kind of debates and discussions with him about. I took more of a techno optimistic vantage point, and
Mhm.
he took more of an eco dystopian viewpoint. We just kind of go back and forth, and we had that shared interest in Dharma practice
Yeah.
between us. He was very much a mentor for me, and he helped me see a couple things. One, that I was in this phase of my practice at the time we first met, where I had really given up any kind of hope that I was going to find some kind of transcendent freedom that like went beyond the world. And
Yeah.
I was much more in a phase of practice. Like instead of waking up, I was waking down. I was starting
Mm.
to descend back into my life
Yeah.
and realize like all the practice that I've done to try to
Mm.
escape my suffering has only brought me more closely in contact with my human experience.
I wish somebody would told me that ahead of time, right?
And they did. They warned me, but I had no clue still.
Yeah.
Um, and so I found myself just caring more and more about the actual specifics of my life and the world. And I didn't have this kind of transcendent i- idealism that I could go back to anymore in my practice. And I think that started to seep into how I was thinking about the world and like broader, human scale things.
Yeah.
And I realized like, oh, this transcendent drive to escape the world is also there in the techno utopian thinkers like Ray Kurzweil and some of these kind of contemporary thinkers who, think we're just going to kind of go into this singularity, technological singularity,
Yeah.
and then everything will be fine.
Right.
It'll be
Depends with their
better than we
bodies,
can even
probably.
imagine.
Yeah.
Right. As long as they let go of their bodies.
Yeah. Yeah. Bodies are inconvenient. Everybody knows that.
Yes, exactly. These bodies just and having to feed them and all
Yeah.
that. Yeah, everyone complains about that in the techno utopian world.
Mhm.
Um, and so yeah, for me, I guess I started turning toward the world and turning toward concerns and feeling like I didn't have that utopian place that I could hold up in anymore because I saw it was an ideal and it wasn't actually like man, it wasn't actually coming true.
Yeah. Right. Right. Right.
Yeah, so that was the turn. Yeah.
Interesting, interesting. But it seems like you started feeling like you're getting grounded, getting more embodied,
Yeah.
started taking kind of our ecological and climate crisis seriously.
More
Um,
seriously, yeah.
more,
Like not
more,
thinking there was an easy way around it.
not
That was
thinking there
going
was
to be
an
like a
easy way
techno
around it.
solution.
But you seem to have also you rejected fatalism, and you've
Yeah.
also pushed back on some of our conversations that you felt were a little bit too doomeristic or too disclosing of the possible or foreclosing on the possibility of how technology can enable some kind of transition to a more beautiful and ecologically robust world.
Mm.
You want to, yeah, I'm curious, kind of to get your reflection on how you see our kind of conversation in the Doomer Optimism world developing, and what critiques you've had, and where you think it would be a fruitful place for us to evolve towards, and turn, especially with our relationship to technology.
Mm. Yeah, I think part of what I learned talking to David, and I feel like this comes out in our conversations as well, and most of the fruitful conversations I have, like the most fruitful ones, I feel like are with people who are also doomer optimists, but who they lean either toward doomer or optimist as their tendency, like it's like
Yeah,
a temperamental thing.
yeah. Mhm.
So I still lean toward the optimistic side,
Yeah.
probably because of my conditioning and just the many decades of being optimistic.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I've gotten a sense, like from talking to you, that maybe you lean slightly in the doomer side. I could be wrong about that, but that's been my read.
Might be a course correction, because to be honest, I also like intuitively, I don't feel worried, right? I intuitively, I
Mm,
feel like, oh, things will be fine. And I feel like I do
mm,
lean towards more of the doomer side, and part of that is just almost feeling like I need to correct for my conditioning,
yeah.
and take things seriously,
Right.
and
Right. Right.
try to really stew myself in the challenges, and I think that's been expressed at various points in the last couple of years, where I come across as very doomer, even though I don't think my intuition has totally caught up with that, which is interesting.
That is
But yeah,
interesting.
I do think in terms of my kind of persona online, I agree with that perspective. That I'm I come across as more on the doomer side.
Okay, you present as a doomer.
Yeah, yeah, and I kind of believe it intellectually, but it's
Yeah.
interesting that there's always kind of this rift between the intellect and the intuition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. So yeah, given that that sometimes people present maybe on one side or the other, and like you're saying, there's a course correction thing going on. So I felt like there was a time where I course corrected hard toward doomerism, and then now I feel like I'm in a course correction. So
Yeah.
it's like maybe a little bit more of a correcting on the other side again. So yeah, given that it's not just like one or the other, it could be maybe it's a process. I found it really helpful to talk to the people that are on the other side of that temperament, wherever they are in their course, because it feels like it helps shine a light back on my own preferences and
Mhm.
biases, and I feel like we can kind of do that for each other in a
Yeah.
way that helps deepen the conversation,
Yeah.
rather than become like camps that are fighting, which is kind of how doomer and optimists,
Mhm.
that aren't doomer optimists seem to
Yeah.
be doing.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, that definitely. I mean, I think the thing I'm optimistic about,
Yeah.
and this could be misplaced optimism, is I do think that our current, let's just call it our current systems state, it just cannot persist in the same way.
Uh-huh.
And so there will be, if we're looking at like this panarchy model of like the back loop, that there will be some kind of crumbling or release or collapse that doesn't necessarily have to be catastrophic, although it could be. I went through a period where I was reading a lot of kind of catastrophic near future, kind of dystopian fiction, and
Mm.
uh, but it doesn't. And my mind kind of goes there. Like I don't really see what I don't really see the signs for optimism, but at the same time, I like it's almost like a faith that people have the capacity to adapt, that humans are a highly adaptable species, that when things go wrong, when we can no longer take certain parts of our livelihood for granted, that's when a lot of the energy will rush forth
Mm.
to adopt new livelihood strategies, new systems that are more resilient and regenerative. And
Mm.
so it's almost like the intuitive optimism is almost like a faith, I think, form of faith.
Yeah. A faith in the adaptability of
Yeah,
humans.
which is probably grounded in systems thinking, and
Hmm.
looking at from an evolutionary lens.
Yeah.
But I don't. It's a faith that
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know what
Yes.
I don't know what uh, the cost will be in terms of what the I'm looking for the right word. Um, the
Mm.
residual damage will be, in this process of transition. And
Right.
we're already seeing it. It's already,
Right.
in some ways, collapse is already here. It's just not well distributed, right? And
Right.
in
Agreed.
many places, people are already dying, through natural disasters, climate related, and
Hmm.
have been, exploited for centuries, through processes of colonialism and slavery and neocolonialism, and these things. So it's just not equally distributed.
Hmm.
Anyway, I feel like I'm kind of rambling. I actually don't know how this is leading to a question. So,
Yeah, I've got a response, which is kind of um, like making it really personal. What you're saying, I think there's an idea in the Buddhist meditation tradition, what they call verified faith.
mm,
So the Buddha was very pragmatic in the sense that he often told the people that were trialing his stuff. He said, "Don't
mm,
take my or anyone else's word for this.
yeah,
Like you actually have to see how it holds up in your experience."
mm,
And there's a difference between having the faith that's what someone's sharing could be helpful versus actually seeing it being helpful.
yeah,
And
mm,
for me, what you're saying, I have some verified faith around it because I've seen what's happened in the last couple of years on a very personal level, where
mm,
the pandemic and the kind of effects that that's had on global systems
Mhm.
has accelerated my own personal adoption and practice around permaculture and agriculture,
Yeah.
and it's really felt like an accelerant on that.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, for the people who are like me, who are in a position where they're kind of ready, there's a certain amount of readiness
Yeah.
and openness. These systems level shifts seem to accelerate and drive
Mhm.
the movement, the adaptation that you're talking about. So I think it's true, but the question that I have is like the readiness piece, like how
Yeah.
ready are people for this, and how many people right now are just like they're getting readied. You know, they're like,
Yeah.
oh wait, holy shit, I'm not going to get my couch like for 6 months that I
Yeah.
ordered
Right.
online. Like,
Right.
what's
Right.
going on? You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I've been trying to, get ready for the last couple of years, and I'm still in kindergarten. I just have
Right. Same.
starting at the age of 36. I'm 38 now. As we're the same age, making up for a lifetime of
Right.
disembodiment is going to take me a while, and
Correct.
I feel like I'm very fortunate that things are still okay, right? That I have time, I have the luxury to to ease into this stuff, even with the pandemic. That has been accelerant for me too, but
Hmm.
it doesn't feel like the big one to me. The big shock yet. And yeah, and I don't know if how long this will take for me to like feel like I have all the systems in place in my home, where I feel like I'm quasi self-sufficient, where in a pinch, if the grid goes down for a month, I could get by, that type of thing. But
Right.
all I can do is just kind of slowly move in that direction with the resources that I have and the time that I have. um,
Right.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm really curious to talk about your kind of more about this process of getting inhabited with this idea of a homestead, and the Hornstead, as you call it. Your last name is Horn. Um, so it
Yes.
makes sense. Um, how is this? Do you want to describe more of this process has been for you? Of like, well, one, so I recently met your grandfather, who is kind of like an OG Doomer optimist, right? He's kind of
Yes,
a
that's true.
prepper, and
Yeah.
he's been building resilient systems for a long time, including
Yeah.
visited his place. And you've talked about how that was really influential for you to connect with your grandfather, and connect with part of your past and your heritage. Yeah, do you want to describe kind of like this process, and where it grew from, and how it's been?
Yeah, sure. I love sharing about this because I really love my grandparents. They're both still alive. They're 88 years old, and they live on their own. On 20 something acres of land out in rural North Carolina, and they're really impressive people on that level of like just being able to take care of themselves, grow their own food, have resilient systems, and being that age,
Yeah.
it's unusual. So I've learned a tremendous amount from them. But when I first was growing up and I grew up with them, living with them or right next to them most of my childhood, I took it for granted. I just didn't realize or know how significant it was that they were still in touch with certain sort of agricultural knowledge.
Yeah.
I just was like, okay, that's cool. We snap beans, we pick imlachia leaves, which is an Arabic plant that my grandfather loves. So my grandfather's from Palestine originally. He grew up. He was born in 1933. So when he was 15, he and his family were pushed off of their land by the British and the new Jewish settlers in
Mhm.
what's become like a pretty important event in the 20th century.
Yeah.
We're still arguing about it. It's still
Wow.
the root cause of a lot of problems in the Middle
Yeah.
East.
Mhm.
But that experience, it was interesting because he grew up essentially in an environment that like by Western standards, we'd probably call it like medieval.
Mhm.
Um, he was in a very simple agricultural slash foraging type community village with
Mhm.
very little formal education, very little resources. And so he grew up foraging and planting as like just like you have to
Yeah.
live.
Yeah.
And
Uh-huh.
so he brought that attitude with him, and I think has always had a farm or always had certainly gardens wherever they've lived.
Mm.
And so I kind of grew up in that kind of with that mindset, but I took it for granted because of like McDonald's and Ingles, the grocery stores is like we don't need these things.
Yeah.
And I saw farming as like the absolute bottom of the rung, in terms of like
Mm.
things I'd want to do.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right below, like working at a fast food restaurant,
Yeah.
but
I
which I
think
did.
that's most people who live in the United States. That's the implicit attitude. Yeah.
That is, and I understand that from the kind of perspective of industrialization, but
Mm.
in recent years, as I've been coming back around to the real value of that, both from a health perspective, but then also from a social, cultural perspective of like, oh, to be able to produce our own food in larger quantities and have that food production be distributed just
Yeah.
is a lot better for society.
Mhm.
And it connects you with the earth in a way that we just don't get. Like we're not outside as much with our hands in the soil.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of just basic embodiment practice, right? It's
Right.
like,
Right.
is there anything better than like
Yeah.
growing food, being outside, raising livestock, or
Right.
taking care of your property? No, I
Mhm.
don't think so.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, if nothing else, even if the amount of food that we produce as a percentage of our diet is
Right.
minimal, if we're thinking that we're in an ecological crisis and one of the root causes is lack of ecological consciousness and a feeling of
Mm.
separation from nature, what better way to gain an embodied ecological consciousness but to engage with local ecology in a kind of co-evolutionary process that is helping it, even if somewhat symbolically, it is nourishing you and your family. um, and it is, I think, grounding a lot of these concerns in real understanding real limits of our environment, right? Like for me, just
Mm.
understanding, okay, if we're not going to use, say, industrial fertilizer that's derived from natural gas using the Haber-Bosch method, well, we need some kind of alternative, right?
Right.
Composting, animal manure, these things, but there's real limits that ecologies enforce that we've kind of overshot or forgotten about, and just coming
Mm.
up on those limits and learning to engage with them in creative ways. I just don't think there's any other way to develop this kind of consciousness. I mean, spending a lot of time in nature is good. That can definitely help, and I don't want to put that down, but that's still not quite engaging in the process of nature as being part of it, right?
Yeah.
And part of its process. That's not to say that appreciating nature is not, a great thing to do as well. I think it is.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I'm curious. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm kind of going back to like part of I think what I learned from my grandfather in particular, he was came up in that environment where those ecological limits were forced. They were enforced.
Yeah,
It's like we don't have food.
yeah,
We need to go out and find some, you know.
yeah,
And
yeah.
there isn't a grocery store.
Right, right.
Um,
Uh-huh.
but he also was an engineer, so when he came to the United States, he became an engineer and was quite good at engineering. And there is that kind of mindset in engineering framework where it's like you're looking at everything in terms of problems and solutions,
Hmm.
and like how could we redo this or re-engineer this.
Yes.
So to me, like these two attitudes
Mhm.
together are very interesting. What are the ecological limits uh, that are actually present? Like we might not feel we have to, they're not enforced in the same way because we
Yeah.
we have all these negative externality depots we can go to. We can just pull, and I do too. I continue to pull from them, and it's kind of a weird paradox and contradiction,
Yeah.
being in between worlds. But also, like you're saying, just being out in nature isn't enough. It's like, how are we? In what sense are we co-engineering these new kinds of systems with nature?
Yeah.
Because we have a hand in it, and that hand is important.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a really good point you're making. I can't just agree with you basically.
Yeah. Well, there's in another episode we talked with permaculture designer Dao Ryan, and she wrote a book talking about this notion of invasive species. And in her work, like they were, when she got into it, they were like spreading chemicals to control them, and she just decided that that whole paradigm wasn't quite right, and that we actually needed to work with our current environment. And she draws this distinction, which I think is really helpful, between this notion of restoration to some kind of pristine state, before, let's just set the date somewhere, right? That we want to get back to, versus regeneration, which is kind of realizing that, well, we're not going to get back to a pristine state. Nature doesn't move backwards, and it only moves forward. And so how can we kind of be co-participants in the evolution of life, right? And that takes a lot of humility, of recognizing patterns that are already there, but it also implies a stewardship, that humans are, can be a keystone species in speeding up the process of regeneration, right? And that's a big theme in like regenerative agriculture is, yeah, we need to replace a lot of our topsoil that has been lost. And if humans are out of the picture, it'll take thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, but humans can deliberately speed up the process of building up topsoil, building up biodiversity, real quickly. And even in deserts, right, as we're seeing examples now, right? And that implies that human ingenuity, right, this kind of unique capacity that humans have to influence the environment, it's been used for destructive ends, but it can also be used for extremely positive ends. And that, and technology is just part of kind of the extended reach of human ingenuity. And so that, coming back to this notion of technology, thinking, rethinking technology as not to control nature, but how can we collaborate with nature using these tools that humans are, particularly qualified to develop and to yield.
Yes. This has me thinking about something a lot more, again, a practical instantiation of the whole Doomer Optimist viewpoint, which to me is like, I would call it like apocalyptimistic design, or Doomer Optimist design. Like it's either way, it works. And the idea for me, it comes from something that this old Zen teacher named Sasaki Roshi said. He said the goal of practice is to become free in heaven and free in hell. Like you want to have a freedom that's robust enough to be free during the expansive phases and the contractive phases both. Like you want to be free with both expansion and contraction. And taking that from the personal level out to like a more social collective level, it's like, yeah, we're going through these expansion and contraction waves, and it seems like we're in a more contractive phase at the moment in a lot of ways. And so to me, it's like choosing things like here at my, at the homestead, like what do I choose? Like, so I've thought about this recently. Should I get a gun? Okay. I think this is a question a lot of people ask themselves. Should I get a gun in America?
That question. Yeah.
Right. Should I get a gun? And I ran it through the apocalyptimistic design parameters, which is, would this be good in heaven and would it be good in hell? If it can be good in both the dystopic scenarios that I could imagine and the utopic ones, then it's probably good now. And so I ran the gun thing through, and I was like, it would be good in dystopia potentially, but in utopia, I don't see it. I don't see a situation in which I'm living in harmony, have enough, that
Right.
like having a gun really serves some real function.
Mhm. Yeah.
So
Interesting.
whereas like I ran the machete through and it, yes, machete works. It
Yeah.
passes that.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
I'm like I'm more prone to get a machete
Okay.
because I think it'll be good in heaven and good in hell. I can imagine going through
Mhm.
the really well, regenerated forests and needing to like kind of make my way and grab some stuff
Right.
and bring it back to throw into the compost pile.
Yeah.
You know?
And you could defend yourself with it,
and
to some
and
degree.
yeah, in close range combat, a machete
Yeah.
probably would be good.
Right. Right. Interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't leave
Yeah.
me defenseless.
Mhm. Yeah. To me, it's so obvious that like something like gardening fits both criteria as well. Right?
Yes,
Like gardening
absolutely.
is just good for us and wholesome in both heaven and hell. Um,
Yes.
Speaking for myself, it's just added so much to my quality of life, to engage with that. I want to jump into kind of the specific activities you're doing at your place. So you started these raised bed gardens, and you had a really I think really kind of brilliant design where you have these kind of raised beds, and then you have the cattle panel or whatever bent over, where like beans can grow. And I think that's really cool. And you have some space where you want to like develop an orchard and get some chickens. Do you
Yes.
want to
Yes.
kind of flesh out, um, hopefully I didn't like uh, preempt your response, but do you want to flesh out kind of your vision for not only your homestead, but also kind of the neighborhood, right? And
Yeah.
the region as well.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, no, I mean I think you've highlighted some of the bigger elements of our long-term design for our
Mhm.
personal, yeah, our personal space. I mean, it includes other things as well, longer term, for me, the whole capacity to generate energy is really seems critical and important. So
Yeah.
we're fortunately in a place where we could get good solar exposure.
Hmm.
So I think solar panels long term and some kind of robust water capturing system where we could
Yeah.
capture the just tens of thousands of gallons that come off of
Yeah.
our roof every year
Yeah.
and be able to
Yeah.
kind of recirculate that at least into the garden if not having like a good backup supply of water.
Hmm.
So things like that, and it's the whole thing of like how to figure out how to take our outgoing waste and turn it into fertilizer
Yeah.
for everything.
Hmm.
It's that whole thing which seems like intellectually quite simple, but in terms of
Hmm.
actual, as you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
design, like
The
actual practical
engineering is,
design,
yeah. Hmm.
it's a real challenge. And
Yeah.
that the part of me that likes that kind of challenge, it's very engaging.
Hmm.
And I think there's a lot to learn together. And to me, the community part is almost more interesting because it seems clear to me that the whole prepper idea of just being completely self-sufficient,
Hmm.
it's not doable for most people because it requires a tremendous amount of land.
Yeah.
Um, and it's also just it's kind of too myopic in terms of looking at the whole picture. Like, of
Hmm.
course, a lot of people are not going to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So we've got to figure out some kind of collective resilience
Yeah.
measures, not just individual resilience. So
Mhm.
I've been really enjoying like our hangouts, which have been, very much slowed down by the pandemic,
Yeah.
but also starting to now meet other folks. Like you've been meeting folks in your area. I've been meeting some folks recently who've been moving into the area who are starting little farms. And it feels like kind of just connecting those nodes
Yeah.
into a larger network of
Yeah.
shared kind of purpose and vision. Like I'm looking forward to meeting this guy who I just met in my neighborhood who's raising lambs and sheep. And I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, how am I going to learn how to make like a lamb curry? Something I
Yeah.
can learn how
Right.
to like introduce lamb back into the diet.
Right.
I
Yeah.
avoided it because I
Yeah.
grew up with a lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like things like that, where I'm very excited about the potential we have in this like eco region, this bioregion to like
Mhm.
start to connect and provide more support and resiliency to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've already last year you gave me some squash seeds, kusa squash seeds, Palestinian squash,
Right.
and they were probably the most successful crop. I mean, they just went crazy. we had, we had
That's
just a little
great.
bed, maybe like 8, 10 plants or something, and it was just incredibly abundant. So you've already you've already done this in terms of started doing this in terms of building up kind of this, again, regional, bioregional kind of patterns of interdependence and trade. And we've talked about both wanting to help build up kind of at a bioregional scale, or at least kind of Western North
Yeah.
Carolina, Blue Ridge scale of creating these
Yes.
networks, you know, starting off by just connecting with people, but then these could eventually turn into more functional patterns of interdependence that
Right.
um, I think will be part of the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's exciting. It's sort of exciting on the one hand to be on the ground floor of a bottom up. Yeah, I don't want to say movement isn't right, maybe the right
mm-hmm.
word, but there's a bottom up kind of stirring of
Yeah,
people who want to connect around these things and aren't just sort of in there like I'm gonna do me my prepping thing, but like
yeah,
I'm gonna do that and I want to be connected to others and figure out how to be more resilient together
yeah. Nice, nice.
and contribute to our local communities. I mean,
Yeah,
also
absolutely.
big importance.
Yeah. Do you? I'm curious. Do you talk with your? I'm sure you talk with your grandfather about kind of your journey, your process of like connecting back to land and stuff.
Mm,
I'm curious, like what kinds of conversations you have with your grandparents about this, and to see. I know that one thing you mentioned is that when you were first getting started, he was kind of like laughing at you a little bit of like, oh,
yeah.
you're about as good of a gardener as like when I was like a in grade school or something. How has that relationship been? Both
Yeah.
seeing him connect, him seeing you connect to this thing that is part of his identity and growing up, but also connecting on the engineering side and the fact that I know that you're like helping him build some of his raised beds, and you're introducing kind of ideas about kind of how certain technology can help augment this. Yeah, I'm curious if you
Yes.
have anything to say about this relationship and how it's evolving.
Yeah, it's really interesting because yeah, he very I mean he's very proud that I'm interested in this stuff. He's very happy about that. And he was kind of joking with me when I first started gardening. He gave me a little plot
Mm,
to plant. You're talking about being 36 when you went into this. It was around the
yeah,
same time for me.
yeah,
A few years ago, he gave me this plot and he said, "Okay, you just plant this." And so I did. I planted some cucumbers and some okra. The okra did great, and it was hard as hell though, planting into the ground, and I
yeah,
just straight into the ground, no extra compost, no nothing, just straight clay, North Carolina clay.
right, right,
uh, the weeds were insane, and I was living quite far away, so I was only able to come once a week to work on it. So I learned a lot from that, and he sort of was joking with me that season. He said, "You remind me of me when I was 6,"
yeah,
which was the time that he started his first garden.
uh-huh.
And he didn't say it was totally unironic.
Hmm.
He was actually just legitimately proud. I said, "Yeah, but I'm 36. That's the difference."
What's an additional three on the beginning of the number?
Yeah, I mean, from his perspective, of 86 at the time, it probably wasn't a big deal. But
Hmm.
yeah, to me, it's like, yeah, 30 years of not doing this, it
Yeah.
makes, like you said, it makes a huge difference. And
Hmm.
we're starting from square one
Yeah.
in our mid 30s.
Right.
Um, but the thing that I've been able to offer him is a lot of new thinking around things. Like
Hmm.
as I've gotten into it, I went to the YouTube, and I found like a lot of interesting farmers and YouTubers who were doing things that I thought were interesting. So I got him turned on to that, and he got kind of fell down the YouTube farming rabbit hole,
Hmm.
and now is trying
Nice.
all kinds of new stuff. So it's been a
Yeah.
very reciprocal
Yeah.
relationship, in that he's helped me kind of learn how to get back to my own roots,
Mhm.
and just given me a place to try that, and given me a lot of support. And then I've given him like access to sort of this internet generation,
Yeah.
hyper innovation,
Yeah.
kind of thing. And he's really
Yeah.
rubbed off on him in a way
Mhm.
that I think is he appreciates.
Yeah. People talk about war between the generations, but this is a great example of, really collaboration between generations and leveraging each generation's strength.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. I think
Mhm.
it's and that generation is more or less not really here anymore. I mean, they're
Yeah.
fading quickly. So he's like, we've
Yeah.
got this huge treasury of knowledge that's kind of
Mhm.
on its way out. That's, I
Yeah.
guess, kind of the sad part of that.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah, I want to. I'm curious to shift gears a little bit to talk about kind of your contemplative work and your work as a meditation teacher, and in particular, uh, you've always kind of been an innovator in this kind of in this space, and now you're focusing a lot on social meditation
Right.
and having critiques about kind of this model of meditation where everyone's kind of alone in a room,
The
in their own
preppers.
mind. Yeah, it's kind of like the prepper model of meditation.
Yeah.
Everyone's prepping their own soul to escape the cycles of birth and death.
Exactly.
And yeah, that's a fascinating connection. Actually, I hadn't explicitly thought of that connection. Yeah, please feel free to riff on that.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think there's some kind of underlying similarity in that mindset of like
Mhm.
individualism, where I'm focused on my own, me and mine. I'm focused on me
Mhm.
and mine. And that could include my family too, but it's like still very self-centered.
Yeah.
That attitude has been really predominant in mainstream Buddhism in America for a long time. It's like it's the cultural milieu in which Buddhism
Mhm.
propagated into.
Yeah.
And so uh, that's kind of the environment I came up in, where we'd go to these retreat centers that are kind of fashioned off of old school monasteries, but are open to people who are non-monastics, who just want to
Mhm.
kind of almost like it's like monastic cosplay, going in and being a monk for like a week or two,
Yeah.
or I did as much as 2 months at a time of like silent hardcore meditation.
Yeah.
And yeah, during these retreats, you just be silent and just practice from morning to night.
Mhm.
And they really had a huge impact on accelerating a certain kind of contemplative development. But then the integration process was hard as hell,
Yeah.
because it's like, okay, how do I bring this deep, profound insight that I had in the middle of a 2 month retreat
Mhm.
into my relationship, or into my work, or into my life, just period. And and those retreats don't really train you on how to do that. They train
Mhm.
you on how to let go of all that so you can have this very deep and profound
Mhm.
experience.
Yeah.
And so one of my teachers, Kenneth Folk, who also had been trained in that same school of thought, he one day realized if he did some of these practices he'd learned out loud with other people instead of doing them silently, that
Mhm.
he could just be a much better teacher. He could
Mhm.
actually
Yeah.
help people figure out how to do the techniques faster, because he could see
Mhm.
them doing it, and
Yeah.
they could hear him doing it. He could model it.
Mhm.
And that was kind of a turning point for me. It's around 2010 that I learned these techniques from him, which he called social meditation. And it just became my primary practice,
Mhm.
and it helped me bridge the gap between those individual profound experiences uh, and being able to bring that awareness into more explicitly into relationships, and into being with others and speaking out loud.
Mhm.
um, and so that for me was a bridge, and eventually I started to understand it as a shift, a kind of paradigm shift for meditation, moving from the view of the self as an individual to ourselves as being networked.
Mhm.
That we were already interconnected and influencing each other in profound ways,
Yeah.
and to just make that and acknowledge that as an explicit part of meditation, just made a lot more sense, and it mirrored how things actually are more accurately,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially in the internet age.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like a necessary upgrade to meditation, updating to be able to do that.
Yeah. And this is also connected to, and maybe we can bring in things like, your background in integral, and how you've evolved with that, and also I think that's related to these new projects you're developing with the Metasonga, these DAOs you're developing, which is kind of a cutting edge of technology that has a potential to be really transformative, and how we organize society. And you have this idea of, one you were describing to me of kind of, there's all these kind of like online meditation cultures developing, right? There's Evolving Ground, there's the Buddhist Geeks, there's perhaps others, and creating this kind of larger space of connectivity, and sharing that's kind of a neutral ground. And it's kind of it has flavors of like meta systematicity, right? Of like that
Yes.
people like David Chapman talks about, and Keegan stage models, and so this all has a kind of a flavor of these larger questions about the evolution of consciousness, and how technology is part of this process. I'm curious if you want to I don't know, elaborate on that, or talk about that. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I have gotten a lot more. Web3 people would use the term bullish. I've
Yeah.
gotten more bullish on the new web infrastructure that's being built. Started with Bitcoin, and it's really now at this point become more of like a real movement. It's not just a few projects. There's
Yeah.
literally thousands. And one of the most interesting cutting edge part of that, I know you've explored this on Doomer Optimism, is the formation of DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. I prefer distributed
Mm-hmm.
autonomous
Yeah.
organizations,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Real
because
quick, we've talked about this before. Do you want to real quick kind of define kind of how you see the difference between decentralized and distributed?
yeah. So I mean, very quick. My view on this is really shaped by the study I did of network theory, and
Mm-hmm.
in particular, a book called Networkologies, which is a philosophy for hyperconnected
Okay.
age, by Christopher Vitale. And he just points out that in terms of network or complexity theory, we can talk about networks being in three different states at least. One is
Mm-hmm.
decentralizing, one is centralizing, and one is distributing. They
Yeah.
have these tendencies where they're either centralizing, getting more kind of everything going to one point, all the power and the resources and connectivity going there, or they're decentralizing, they're breaking apart and becoming more kind of spread out,
Mm-hmm.
or they're distributing, which is more like the internet or a brain, and how a brain or internet works, where you have these networks that are both centralized in some ways and also decentralized, and then they're communicating across the network. And
Mm-hmm.
there's this greater wholeness that emerges among the network, that if you get too decentralized, that distribution will stop happening, or if you get too centralized, it'll stop. So
Yeah.
there's almost this sweet spot of between centralized and decentralized, where a
Right.
distributed, like intelligent
Mm-hmm.
whole network
Right.
dynamic can emerge.
Right.
And I think
Yeah.
that's what we're aiming for, hopefully, with Web3, not just to
Yeah.
kind of break apart the old legacy systems. I mean, that's an
Mm-hmm.
important step, but
Yeah.
it's not the goal.
Mm-hmm.
Because we could easily just decentralize the old centralized systems, and then they could reaggregate in a new, even more hellish form, and they probably
Yeah.
will to some degree.
Right. Right.
um,
Mm-hmm.
but I think there is this unique period that we're in, this unique time, and I saw it with Web 2, where things are very malleable and moldable for a little
Mm-hmm.
while. Like you
Yeah.
can actually get in and be part of something or help create something new
Mm-hmm.
during this kind of open period of innovation, and then it collapses, and then you can't do shit for a while.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I just sense, having been through a couple of these cycles before, we're in a similar kind of moment with the web, where there's a possibility of organizing differently and of collaborating differently and of creating projects that are values based, that are rooted in sort of regenerative
Mhm.
worldview, if you will.
Mhm.
Um, and that part, it's exciting, but it's also worrying,
Mhm.
because I think that when people are too much on the doomer side of things, they start to get cynical. They don't think it's possible. They
Yeah.
think there's a fatalistic thing of that this is bound to just be co-opted by the big
Yeah.
players and venture capitalists, and so why bother?
Yeah.
And I see some of that happening, and it concerns me, because those very people with that awareness are the ones that are set up to be able to create something new.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so many of them are opting out of that. Not everyone, though. There are lots of people who are, and maybe they'll come around later. They'll sit to see it's possible. Like Gregory Lando, you've had on
Mhm.
your show. My
Yeah, we will. We
friend.
will. We haven't interviewed him yet.
Oh, you haven't interviewed him yet? Well, that'll be great. And there's a number of projects I see. Seeds, what he's doing. Some parts of the Ethereum network, IOTA. There's different places where this
Yeah.
regenerative attitude is
Mhm.
like alive in the culture. It's even animating these crypto networks.
Yeah.
And so I have my own kind of things I'm thinking about within that broader space
Mhm.
of like, what could we take that is currently centralized, running as a standard organization, like a
Mhm.
for-profit or a nonprofit, that could be better served as a decentralized or distributed network of people who are self-organizing and who have the maturity to be able to come in, inhabit a particular role or function, and
Mhm.
to be able to kind of like drive things and
Mhm.
coordinate without having to have as much of these centralized control and command
Right.
mechanisms in place.
Yeah. Keyword there is maturity.
It's very important that the
Yeah.
people be able to do that, to inhabit that. So I don't think it is going to be for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. So a while back I gave a presentation on the Stoa, and I was talking about how different movements, could collaborate, and two of them, one of them I was talking about the decentralization movement as well as bioregionalism and localism, and I was
Yes.
calling it decentralization, but I was basically meaning like Web3 and crypto and
Yep.
cosmological production, and just this whole space. And one of the arguments I made is that there's the potential for the physical infrastructure, but it doesn't necessarily bring in the human maturity, and that's where
Yes.
kind of a meta modern or an integral sensibility can really
Yes.
play a huge role of we need to be able as humans, perhaps it gets into this whole questions about like determinism, and is it is it techno determinism, or is it cultural determinism, and which way does it go? It's
Hmm.
probably feedback loops, and it's probably not linear. Actually, I'm pretty sure it's not linear. And so you know it's like, will these new platforms arise and we join them, and it kind of enforces a new level of maturity, or are we bringing this maturity into it, and how does this kind of
Hmm.
human potential movement, we could say, kind of writ large, interface with these interactions with the possibilities of these new technologies, and not only getting the
Yes.
protocols right to not just have it revert back to a centralized model, but
Right.
having the intentions and values be right as well.
Absolutely. There's a really good example, I think, of a company that I've been following in this DAO space, that I think is really doing this. They're doing it well, and they're called Hypha DAO, HYPHO. No, and it's not DAO actually. They've renamed DHO,
Mhm.
Distributed Human Organization.
Okay.
And so what they've been doing, they're part of the larger Seeds network, which is a regenerative,
Mhm.
bioregional kind of crypto network.
Yeah.
And they're building on top of that or within that ecosystem. And what they, from the very beginning, as they started to try to build stuff,
Mhm.
they realized like how many of the kind of old school governance models and economic models were just being instantiated unconsciously in these new networks.
Mm-hmm.
Just like autocracy, digital autocracy,
Mm-hmm.
digital consensus, digital whatever. And they sort of were like, okay, yeah, we don't want to, their primary goal is to build a new kinds of economic systems
Mm-hmm.
that actually support the kinds of things we're talking about. So what they've ended up creating, it's still in beta, and I haven't got to try it yet, but they've created essentially a whole platform for distributed autonomous organizations that want to run using these more, I would call them teal organizational patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Teal coming from the work of spiral dynamics, which
Mm-hmm.
points to kind of a more integrated perspective where you can see all these different perspectives and you can kind of start to include different perspectives in a larger
Mm-hmm.
approach.
Yeah.
We've been practicing at Buddhist Geeks one of these teal operating systems called holacracy
Mm-hmm.
since almost the time that it arose.
Yeah.
And what I found is like it's a tremendously cool thing where people can, autonomously inhabit their roles, and that there's no
Mm-hmm.
bosses in the traditional sense.
Mm-hmm.
There are important roles that help bring people into different roles, but they don't give people deadlines, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a very different kind of management system. And I've always found like that management system, it doesn't quite mesh with the organizational structures that we have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's like it's ahead of its time, and
Yeah.
in a way it's like we've been waiting. I think we've been having to wait for the infrastructure and
Right.
this kind of digital Web3 suite of
Mm-hmm.
technologies, the tokens, the
Mm-hmm.
non-fungible tokens, the distributed autonomous networks, the
Mm-hmm.
crypto, more or less non-mutable blockchain stuff. Like
Mm-hmm.
all that had to kind of be present to to run as the hardware on top of which these sort of new organizing practices could be run in a way that actually works.
Right.
So Haifa Do is
Mm-hmm.
doing that, I
Yeah.
think, in a really interesting way. And I see those kind of projects starting to pop up and emerge. And to me, it's like when that becomes more, when people are able to use those platforms to be able to self-organize, then we'll be able to create ultimately new kinds of commons.
Mm-hmm.
We'll actually I'll take the space I'm in, for example, where Buddhist Geeks is a sangha. We call ourselves a
Yeah.
sangha. We have a particular perspective or way of looking at practice. Like we teach social meditation, and we teach, 6 ways to meditate. We have all of our
Mm-hmm.
models that we
Yeah.
use. And
Mm-hmm.
other sanghas do as well. Like you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, evolving ground. This is a sangha that was developed by your ex
Mm-hmm.
podcast host
Yeah.
and one of my old friends, Charlie Alberry,
Mm-hmm.
and they've created a new contemporary Vajrayana community that that has a different set of like models and ideas and practices. But there's a lot that we share in common. And currently, we and others like us don't really coordinate or connect much. We're like sitting in our own isolated spaces trying to do our thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just noticed there's a real opportunity for us to come together into a shared commons that is not run or governed by any one of us. Because
Mm-hmm.
if it's run or governed by one of us, then it's really just essentially amounts to you coming and becoming absorbed in my community.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like
Mm-hmm.
we can't maintain our own autonomy and our own
Yeah.
unique flavors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which cell is gonna engulf the other one?
Right. Which, yeah, exactly. It becomes that old sort of like the centralized monopolistic game of who's going to grow faster, quicker, have more resources to consume the
Right.
rest, and
Right.
become like the megapoly
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
Dharma.
Right. Right.
uh,
Yeah.
so what if instead we could come together and create a shared commons? I've
Mm-hmm.
theorized this as a Metasonga space.
Mm-hmm.
It's like where you could have the own internal integrity of your community would not need to be compromised, but rather could be enriched
Yeah.
through cross community conversation and practice,
Yeah.
cross paradigmatic practice.
Right.
To me, and that it would be governed by the collective itself in a way that people agree to, whether using democratic principles and practices or holocratic or sociocratic or
Mhm.
whatever cratic it is, you know,
Yeah.
that you agree, like, this is how we're going to govern this shared commons.
Mhm.
And this shared commons will become a space that's for everyone who participates in it.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and to me, that's really quite exciting, to have the mechanism or the tools to be able to craft shared commons together.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of, it sounds very much like this notion of cosmopolitan localism that, you know, I've been pondering about a lot and writing about. And there's this, you know, there is this kind of interesting tension. I think it can be a generative tension of, as you said, each sangha has its own kind of internal, you know, sovereignty in a way. Its own,
Yes.
you know, it regenerates itself, kind of like a cell. You know, it has its own integrity, but it's not isolated. It's not closed off. It's still connected. There's this space, this commons, where these ideas, the shared, you know, wisdom can flow and be adapted if, you know, each respective sangha so chooses, and new knowledge can be formed through this interaction. And, you know, that's beautiful, because that's really kind of like best case scenario for a transition. You know, that's kind of the world that we're moving into, right?
Yes.
And you know, at certain, and thinking about multi-scale and, you know, village and watershed and bioregions being a really important scale there. But basically that same thing that you're interviewing in this, you know, particular type of space of Buddhist contemplative practice, you know, seems to be, you know, that knowledge, you know, that you're perhaps developing there can spill over into other, you know, other domains, you know, other governance concerns and things of that nature.
Yes.
And so that's really, it's really
Yes.
neat. Yeah.
It is exciting, and I think what the tech folks are mostly missing right now, like the Web3 techies,
Mm-hmm.
is they're mostly missing just how hard of a problem it is, the
Yeah.
self-governance problem.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they're sort of like they're putting too much faith in code and not
Mm-hmm.
enough faith in their capacity as humans to learn how to collaborate and coordinate
Yeah.
better.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and so that's
So
something,
definitely something that
again.
Rich Decibels focuses a lot on is
Yes, he
human collaboration.
does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He's doing a great job of that. Yeah, because he was part of this community, the Inspiral community, that was like a
Mm-hmm.
pre-DAO DAO.
Yeah.
Like they were one of the first that were really exploring some of these decentralized organizing practices,
Mm-hmm.
without having the web infrastructure that could actually instantiate it in a more real way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very
Yeah.
interesting.
Hmm.
Uh, this might be, this might seem like a hard right turn, but maybe we can tie it back.
Okay, let me strap in.
Yeah, yeah. Well, see, so Game B community just released a video, and I saw that you were commenting on it and favorable towards it, and I think I'm generally positive, but I have some mixed feelings. I'm curious
Mm.
how where you see the state of Game B and how it relates to these other communities and ideas we've been talking about, and what that video, in terms of piece of art, some might say, you know,
Mhm.
some have said it's cringe or it's propaganda or it's cultish, and other people, you know, but most people are
Yeah.
very, are very favorable towards it. It seems to incorporate a lot of kind of like the bioregionalist sensibility as well. And I'm curious,
Yes.
yeah, what do you think? Yeah, what are your thoughts on the video and how it relates to all of these topics and Game B in general?
Yeah, yeah. I've had a very it's like a gradual relationship with Game B, where I've
Yeah,
kind of very slowly gotten into the whole thing, and I think actually
yeah.
this video
I
for me
remember when
was a
you were critiquing it a lot online, and you were one of the first one. Like there was a period like November of 2019 or something where everybody was just all of a sudden got raptured by like Game B. All we do is just need to switch to Game B. That's it's like, why didn't we think of that before? Just like go to
yes.
Game A to Game B. That's it. And everybody was really excited. And you were one of the few people who was like, I think you are pretty critical, and in some ways you are prophetic, because then it's just kind of all the enthusiasm died, and I'm sure the game B communities kind of went into spore mode and went private, and you kind of went quiet for a while,
Yeah.
and a lot of the
Yeah.
enthusiasm was lost, and now it seems to kind of be putting its head above water again. Anyway, I cut you off, so go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great read on it. Yeah, I was critical because I had already myself been through the integral rapture.
Yeah.
I was at ground zero of Ken Wilber's Integral Institute and the community around that. And it was quite a rapture, man. Like it was something to behold. I mean, there were famous monks and teachers and poets and politicians and like pretty much of every walk of life, friends of Ken's who'd been influenced by his integral meta theory, including the Wachowskis, and
Yeah.
he ended up becoming one of the two official philosophers on to comment on the Matrix,
Wow.
So he and Cornel West laid down the philosopher tracks for the Matrix trilogy, and was a his philosophy was a huge influence on the Matrix. So that was an incredible rapture. We thought we were going to change the world. Most of the people working for him we were in our 20s. We were hyper idealistic, but not a lot of real world experience. And the whole thing ended up rapturing and then collapsing.
Yeah.
And I think what I learned from that is like just to be wary of any kind of meta theoretical raptures.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because like while there really are needed, like we do need these meta theoretical like approaches and orientations in communities like very badly, that they're not going to be able to live up to their own hype. Like they're just
Yeah.
not. I saw that so clearly in the integral rapture. And so I was just skeptical from the onset about the community itself. And I didn't, for that reason, didn't want to step on the inside of it. That said, I think with what I've seen them develop, I've seen a few things. I've seen some of the key kind of philosophers like Daniel Schmachtenberger, Jordan Hall, these guys, the Encinitas crew. I've seen them refine their thinking
Yeah.
and start to become connected with important people like Tristan Harris, who are helping amplify their reach so that their ideas can actually enter into the mainstream. Now, that was one thing Ken did well, Ken Wilber did well too. Like he was able to craft a philosophy that ended up reaching the mainstream in some ways, at least some key players. And I think any philosophy that doesn't do that, like doesn't eventually become relatable to people on like that are doing things, is just it's kind of a mental masturbation. And I think they've crossed that threshold, which is very interesting. And to me, they're very much doing something similar to what Wilber was trying to do. It feels very meta theoretic to me in terms of the kind of orientation they have. Now, one thing I think is kind of missing that the integral community had more of was more of an emphasis on consciousness and on the interior aspects of humans, like the self consciousness and cultural consciousness. Whereas like the game B folks seem to be almost like emphasizing above all else these kind of like game theory and economic theory and
Complexity science and
complexity science, like all which an integral terminology would be like right hand quadrant stuff or like exteriors. And to me, like the interior and the exterior being coming together is very important. Like that's something I've continued to hold from integral theory, and the individual and the collective also. We can't collapse onto either side. We've got to hold all of the four. So I think what they've done that I recognize from integral as well with that video is they've kind of been able to create a mythos, like a mythological doorway into game B. That's a piece of art. And the response about cults, I don't even care about that shit anymore, to be honest with you,
Yeah.
because it's like, dude, we're already part of a cult. It's a death cult and it's killing us.
Yeah.
So maybe we need other better cults to
Right.
get
Right.
ourselves unentangled from this cult.
Right. Right.
It's like, if you don't think this is a cult, I don't know. You
Uh,
you're the most brainwashed person there
yeah.
is.
Right. Right. Yeah.
so, so it's just like, come on, give me a
Mhm.
break. But
Interesting.
yeah, I don't take that things, I don't take that very seriously. Like, there can be really cults that are really damaging, are ones that aren't open to the outside and people
Yeah.
can't come and go as they please. Like, that's
Right.
not what's happening in game B,
Yeah.
as far as I can tell. So it's not a true
Mhm.
cult.
Yeah.
But to me, that, like, the mythological, like being able to speak to people at a mythological level of,
Mhm.
like, and seeing this as a game. Again, it goes back to the Matrix. It was very much a redoing of the Matrix in that
Mhm.
video.
Yeah.
It's like, you've got
Yeah.
this thing on the
Yep.
back of your neck,
Yep. Yep.
and it's
Definitely
it's
inspired
like,
by that. Yep. Hmm.
yeah, absolutely. And that is the mythos of our time.
Hmm.
So to me, it makes sense to use that, to harness that,
Hmm.
and to use art to communicate at a more intuitive or mythological level, not
Yeah.
just talking heads. That
Hmm.
not everyone's going to respond to that. And integral theory really blew up when integral art became part of the movement.
Yeah. Right.
When
Hmm.
artists were translating these ideas, and politicians were like, when they started to translate the heady theory
Hmm.
into actual, like, music, or into art, or into practice, or into, like,
Hmm.
livelihood, like, that's where it started to have real power.
Yeah.
And I think game B has made that transition into
Hmm.
that level of, like, influencing the broader
Hmm.
culture. And I think that's really good
Yeah.
overall, like, even if they have major blind spots, or, which
Yeah.
I'm sure will. But
Yeah, I was pretty impressed that when they had the post film discussion, or dialogos as they called it,
hmm.
and you know, and also, Jeremy Johnson, he recently had a podcast where he was talking about this as well, of not
Yes,
just treating the art
he's an old
as
integral guy, by the way. He was
Jeremy
at the
Johnson.
Integral Institute. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and he's very much, he kind of started with Wilbur and then went to Gebser, and now is, I think, a little bit more of a nonlinear fluid integralist in terms of stages and stuff. But yeah, he's
Yes.
great. But this idea that art is just meant to deliver a message, and if that's just what it is, it's propaganda. But if
Mm, mm.
it's it's like a vector to or a meme to deliver a message. But the way they were talking about it, I was pretty impressed with, was no, actually art itself is its own form of agency, and it actually reveals truths that kind of co-evolve with the intellectual side, and it reveals certain possibilities, and so it's not just instrumental, right? It's actually part of the sense making itself,
Yes.
and beyond the sense making. It's not just making sense, but it's feeling into the mythos, and feeling into these other aspects of reality that we can argue are just as real, if not more real. Um,
Right.
so the way that they, that was my sense of how they were talking about it, and also, you know, Jeremy kind of had a critique that they could have talked about it in those terms a bit more. And of course, I can't repeat how Jeremy puts it because he's just so eloquent about these things. But yeah,
Sure.
I'm happy with, in terms of the responding to the film, how they're trying to contextualize it. I thought that was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, there's another thing that I think, I walked away with from that film feeling hopeful about, in terms of that movement, the Game B community,
Mm-hmm.
which was the way that they have seemed to also incorporate and integrate some things around indigenous perspectives. And you mentioned
Yeah.
bioregionalism.
Mm-hmm.
I know that part of their advisory team on that film was, a fellow named Tyson
Young Porter.
Youngkaporta, who,
Mhm.
yeah, who's, I think, has been on the Both And podcast, if I
He hasn't
remember.
yet, but he should be.
Oh, he hasn't. Oh, cool. Okay, great.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So, a- as an indigenous lecturer and someone who lives, his roots are in the indigenous tradition in Australia, you know, it was hopeful for me to hear that that community, which has been largely made up of white dudes, you know,
Yeah.
to put a very simplistic kind of
Yeah.
frame on it, we're able to kind of begin to incorporate that into their vision. And I think,
Mm.
to me, going back to integral theory and integral community, like one of the things I don't think that community did well was to kind of have a more wholesome integration of what they
Mm.
called the pluralistic
Yeah.
meme,
Hmm.
and and to kind of be more reactionary
Yeah.
toward it. And I
Hmm.
think if the folks, meta theoretical folks who can integrate wokeism
Hmm.
as a healthy part of what they're doing, but not the kind of like rabid wokeism
Yeah.
that just like feeds on its own,
Yeah. Yeah.
the zombie wokeism.
Uh-huh.
Like I think, to me, that's a real hallmark of a meta community that's going to thrive, and bring something good into the world, that can point out the limits of that but still honor the
Mhm.
truth in it.
Right. Right.
So I was happy to see that. That made me more hopeful about the direction.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah,
Well, I think we'll wrap up pretty soon, but
great.
before we do, are there any topics that you wish I would have broached or asked, or I guess is there anything else that it would be nice to explore together before we wrap up that I didn't think about?
Hmm. No, I feel like we touched on a lot of things. I think the only thing, just how much depth is in any one of the topics that we brought up. But they're
Yeah.
like so deep, and so
Yeah.
we can't touch on all of them.
Yeah.
But I think overall we touched on a tremendous amount of things that feel
Nice.
relevant and important. Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, what I'm left with is just like how we're trying to kind of bring this like very heady, like
Yeah.
meta theoretical thing
Uh-huh.
down into
Yeah.
like real world ecologies,
Yeah. Hmm.
and how challenging that is.
Hmm.
But then how many folks we can learn from who
Yeah.
really coming from the opposite direction,
Yeah.
you know,
Hmm.
who've had, like, my grandparents, they're not
Yeah.
heady at all about this
Yeah.
stuff,
Uh-huh.
but they have so much knowledge and they're so much more advanced when it
Hmm.
comes to some of the things that we talked about.
Yeah.
So I guess that's what I'm left with, kind of thinking about how we have an opportunity, to like really connect with those kind of folks who aren't maybe coming from such a
Yeah.
kind of philosophical or theoretical bent background.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one thing I really like about localism, kind of as a sensibility and a memeplex. For
Mm,
it's blind spots, which I do think there are certain blind spots, but just in terms of if you read an author like when I read an author like Wendell Berry in 2020 when I was starting homesteading, I mean it felt so in some way so simple, so clear, like this crystal
mm,
water, just so and just there's so much humility in this kind of describing this relationship with nature and how that's related to spirituality and how that's related to culture, and his diagnosis of him seeing kind of like this rise of industrialization in the food system and how communities are hollowed out. And for me, one thing that localism speaks to more than say bioregionalism or definitely any of these kind of meta theoretical movements is just kind of these very simple things that aren't actually so simple. They're simple in theory, but in practice, it's a lifetime to inhabit. It's a lifetime to
right.
to develop a relationship with your soil, to develop relationships with your neighbors in patterns of functional interdependence,
Right.
including neighbors that you won't agree with ideologically, and
Right.
figuring out ways to navigate that where you're not tolerating certain things that you shouldn't tolerate, but at the same time you're finding alternative ways to connect with them that
Right.
are more tangible. And
Right.
you know to me, when I came across these kind of localism in general, and authors like Wendell Berry, it was just coming from the meta space. It was like a breath of fresh air, and I went down that sensibility pretty hard for a while, and I'm glad I did. Now it's like I feel like I've kind of come out with more perspective, and it's part of kind of a larger holistic sensibility and vision. But it's something that I think can really, in terms of what you're talking about, of like connecting with people who can't speak this meta theoretical language, but have so much wisdom and knowledge that to share if they want, right, and if they feel respected, and that many folks like us just don't have. We're just complete 6-year-olds.
Right now, we're 9 now at this point.
9 years old, 9-year-olds, yeah, exactly. So I just, maybe that's just a kind of a reflection on that.
It makes sense. Yeah, thanks.
Well, cool, Vince. I thought this was a nice conversation. I enjoyed it.
Likewise. I hope it's helpful.
And we'll be seeing each other in person sometime soon, I hope. We're 2 hours away from each other.
I can't wait till we have a big enough crew where we can have like work parties. I do think that we should now. Now we had like another fellow move in who's kind of on the same page, Jeffrey. And you have various friends, and I've connected with a couple of folks, and at some point, I think I see maybe like in the next 2 or 3 years, we should have some kind of big gathering or retreat, that kind of brings us all together and allows us to share food and it's a great way to connect.
I don't think we're quite there yet. I think we need to develop these relationships and these networks more informally first, but I think we'll get there. It feels
that way. It feels like